Have you ever wondered what happens when the kindest soul you know finally snaps? Carl Jung once documented a psychological transformation so disturbing, he called it the most terrifying case of human nature he had ever seen. It wasn't about monsters, criminals, or tyrants. It was about empaths, the gentle ones, the healers, the people who feel everything, the ones everyone assumes will never fight back. But Jung discovered something chilling. When an empath reaches their breaking point, they don't explode in rage. They awaken. And in that awakening, they become something society isn't ready to face. Psychological warriors who can see through every mask, every lie, and every manipulative game. In this video, I'm going to take you deep into Jung's most haunting case files, where he reveals the moment an empath transforms from silent victim to unstoppable force. You'll learn why betrayal is always the final trigger, how suppressed intuition becomes their deadliest weapon, and why Jung himself admitted these cases shook him to his core. If you've ever felt underestimated, silenced, or told that you were too sensitive, stay with me until the end, because what you'll hear may change the way you see yourself and the way you understand human psychology forever. And before we go deeper, let me ask you this. Have you ever felt like you see everything but no one believes you? If that resonates, write it in the comments. I see everything. And if you want more stories like this, real cases, hidden psychology, and the secrets Jung didn't dare publish, make sure to subscribe right now. Not for me, but for you. Because if this story speaks to you, it means you're ready to discover what's been hiding inside you all along. The kindest people aren't weak. They're weapons waiting to be forged. Let's step into the day the empath snaps. Carl Jung's clinic in Zurich was full of patients who seemed, at first glance, fragile. They were the ones who apologized for taking up space, who blamed themselves for everything wrong in their lives, who carried invisible scars of abuse disguised as politeness. Jung noticed something strange. Many of them were empaths. These were people who had spent years absorbing the rage of alcoholic parents, the betrayals of unfaithful partners, the dysfunction of broken families. They weren't just hurt. They were repositories for other people's pain, emotional shock absorbers for entire social systems. They carried everyone's burden and never complained. But here's the part that shook Jung. They weren't just enduring abuse. They were cataloging it. When Jung asked them to describe their relationships, he didn't hear the disorganized ramblings of victims. He heard surgical detail. These empaths knew every insecurity of their abusers, every trigger, every weakness. They had been collecting data with frightening precision. At first, Jung didn't understand what he was hearing. Then, the truth dawned on him. These patients weren't keeping diaries of pain. They were building psychological war rooms in silence. Their minds were storing maps of human behavior, waiting, though even they didn't know it, for the day everything would change. Jung's blood ran cold as he realized. These people weren't broken. They were potential strategists, and the only reason the world hadn't seen their power was because they hadn't yet reached their breaking point. This discovery terrified Jung more than any psychotic break because it revealed a possibility he had never imagined. That empaths, those tender, quiet souls, were in fact psychological geniuses in disguise, and sooner or later something would push them past silence. And when that day came, the transformation would not be reversible. If you've ever been told you're too sensitive, you already know what Jung's patients lived through. You feel everything, every shift in tone, every hidden tension, every lie behind a smile. And yet, instead of being praised for this gift, you've probably been silenced. People roll their eyes. They call you dramatic. They tell you to stop overthinking. But here's the truth Jung uncovered. Empaths don't break because they feel too much. They break because the world convinces them their feelings are wrong. That gaslighting, that constant dismissal, it's like poison. It trains empaths to distrust their own perception, to apologize for truths no one else is willing to face. Imagine the weight of carrying secrets you never asked for, the affairs you sense but can't prove, The manipulations you see unfolding in silence, the anger boiling beneath someone's calm exterior. You see it all, but if you speak up, you're punished. So you bury it, and year after year, it builds. That is why Jung asks words hit so hard. The empath doesn't have a breakdown. They have a breakthrough. The day comes when their mind can no longer deny what their heart has always known. If you've ever felt invisible, unheard, underestimated, you're not alone. Jung believed people like you were not broken, but advanced. You are wired to recognize patterns others miss. You process emotional data faster, deeper, more accurately than the average person. That's not weakness. It's a superpower waiting to be claimed. And if you've ever been on the edge of snapping, where silence feels unbearable, understand this. That edge isn't madness. It's awakening. Tell me in the comments if you've felt it. That moment you realized you weren't crazy, you were right all along. And if this speaks to you, subscribe now. Not for me, for you. Because if this resonates, it means your journey isn't random. You were built for this. And the world needs empaths who finally wake up. Carl Jung began noticing something unsettling in case after case. The transformation of the empath didn't happen slowly, like healing a wound. It happened suddenly, like a switch being flipped. And the trigger was always the same. Betrayal. Not just any betrayal, but betrayal by the person the empath trusted most. A partner's infidelity. A parent's hidden cruelty. A friend's deception. The shock wasn't in the act itself. It was in the realization that the empath had seen the signs all along, but chose to ignore them. They had silenced their own perception in the name of love, loyalty, or peace. For years, they endured. They absorbed the pain. They tried to fix it, tried to be perfect, tried to forgive, until the day came when their intuition could no longer be denied. Jung called this the clarity event. What he observed was chilling. People expected these empaths to collapse in tears, to scream, to rage. Abusers were prepared for emotional chaos. But that's not what happened. Instead, the empath became unnaturally calm, almost surgical. They began to speak, not with cruelty but with terrifying precision. They exposed everything they had seen, everything they had recorded, everything they had silently endured. Every lie, every manipulation, every hidden truth was laid bare, piece by piece, like a surgeon identifying diseased organs before removing them. This wasn't revenge, it was clarity. It was the integration of shadow and light, of perception and power. For the first time, the empath used their gift not to excuse behavior, but to reveal it. And the effect on everyone around them was devastating. Jung described this moment as one of the most frightening transformations in human nature, because once it happened, there was no going back. Jung couldn't ignore what he was witnessing. He decided to test it. Quietly, without explanation, he brought colleagues and visitors into the same room as his patients. He never told the empaths who these people were or what their histories involved. Within minutes, the results stunned him. These so-called fragile patients could identify traumas with shocking accuracy. Childhood neglect, relationship betrayals, professional insecurities. They named wounds that even Jung's trained colleagues hesitated to reveal. And they weren't guessing. Their accuracy was above 95%. Time after time, person after person, the empath read them like an open book. But here's the part that shook Jung to his core. These empaths weren't mystical. They weren't psychic. They weren't channeling anything supernatural. They were simply paying attention, on a level most humans will never reach. Every flicker of a micro-expression, every hesitation in tone, every contradiction between words and posture, they noticed it all, cataloged it, and connected the dots. What most people call intuition, they called data. Years of absorbing abuse had sharpened them into analysts of the human soul. They weren't just feeling, they were processing, calculating, remembering. Their minds had become laboratories of emotional truth. Society had labeled them too sensitive. In reality, they were running the most advanced emotional recognition systems ever documented, and the world had no idea. Jung's hands shook as he wrote his notes, because he realized he wasn't treating victims at all. He was sitting across from hidden psychological geniuses, people who had been forced into silence, people who could now see straight through every facade, and the terrifying question that haunted him was simple. What happens when one of these empaths decides to stop staying silent? Jung noticed something unnerving. Once an empath reached this state, there was no going back. They didn't slip into old patterns of self-blame or people-pleasing. They didn't second-guess their perceptions anymore. The transformation was permanent. He described it as the integration of shadow. The empath no longer denied the parts of themselves society told them to hide, their intelligence, their intuition, their quiet strength. They accepted it all. And once they did, they became what Jung called psychologically complete. But what made this terrifying wasn't aggression. These awakened empaths weren't cruel. They didn't lash out. They didn't seek revenge. Instead, they became selectively empathetic, still deeply caring, but only toward people who truly deserved it. For the first time, they controlled where their energy flowed. Abusers and manipulators sensed it instantly. People who once walked over them suddenly felt uneasy in their presence. They couldn't explain why, but they knew something fundamental had changed. It was as if predators could smell the danger. Jung called it the predator's instinct. Manipulative people can sense when their tactics no longer work. They feel it in their bones. And around integrated empaths, they retreat, like vampires from sunlight. The empath didn't announce their transformation. They didn't need to. Their presence alone unsettled those who once exploited them. Jung wrote, "The awakened empath doesn't need to declare their power. Others feel it in their marrow." This was the moment Jung realized he wasn't observing healing. He was observing evolution, a human being who could not be manipulated, who could not be gaslighted, who could not be broken again. And that terrified him. Imagine living your whole life as the emotional sponge for everyone else, the fixer, the forgiver, the one who swallows pain in silence. Then imagine the day comes when you stop apologizing for what you see. You stop pretending you're wrong. You stop caring what was never yours. That day is the day the empath snaps, and Jung saw it with his own eyes. The breakdown wasn't chaos. It was order. It wasn't rage. It was truth. They didn't lose their heart. They gained their backbone. Think about the power of that moment. Every manipulator who thought they could keep lying suddenly stripped bare. Every abuser who thrived in the dark suddenly forced into the light. Not by violence, but by clarity. By words spoken with precision sharper than any blade. Jung called it one of the most terrifying transformations in human nature, because once an empath integrates their shadow, they're no longer safe to exploit. They're no longer easy to control. They become the one thing manipulators fear most, someone who sees them completely, but no longer needs them. And maybe you've felt glimpses of this yourself. That shift where people start treating you differently, where those who used to drain you grow nervous in your presence, and those who are genuine suddenly feel safe with you. That's not an accident. That's awakening. If you've reached that point, or you know you were close, write it in the comments. I see you, but I don't need you. And if this message touches you, subscribe right now. Not because I asked, but because your journey isn't random. It's time you had words for what you've always felt. Jung's discoveries prove it. You are not weak. You are not broken. You are powerful beyond belief. The question is no longer if you'll awaken. The question is, when? Once the empath integrated their shadow, everything around them began to shift. Jung documented case after case where these individuals rebuilt their lives almost overnight. Not recklessly, but with a kind of ruthless precision. They left abusive partners without hesitation. They cut ties with toxic family members, not in anger, but in silence. They stopped justifying themselves. They stopped apologizing for boundaries. And within months, their lives looked completely different. Jung noticed a pattern. These transformed empaths didn't storm out in drama or chaos. They simply walked away with calm finality. And that calm was what terrified everyone left behind. Because manipulators thrive on reaction. They feed on tears, on fights, on apologies. But an awakened empath gives them nothing. Just silence. Their presence itself became unsettling. People who once exploited them couldn't stand to be near them anymore. Not because they were cruel, but because they could no longer be fooled. Jung described it as if these empaths had become human mirrors. They reflected people's truth back to them, without judgment, without distortion. For the healthy people in their lives, this was liberating. Friends and partners who were genuine felt safer than ever. But for the toxic ones, it was unbearable. They felt exposed, as if every mask they wore had suddenly cracked. Jung realized something profound. The empath's transformation didn't just change the individual. It disrupted entire systems. Families collapsed, not because the empath destroyed them, but because dysfunction couldn't survive without someone to absorb it. The awakened empath no longer held everyone else's pain, and in that release the world around them was forced to evolve, or crumble. The more Jung studied these transformed empaths, the more unsettled he became. Their new clarity didn't just protect them, it gave them extraordinary influence. They could read people's intentions before a word was spoken. They could sense dishonesty with the accuracy of a lie detector. They could predict how someone would behave in a relationship, in business, even in conflict. Jung realized they weren't just survivors. They were strategists of human nature itself. And here's the part that chilled him. With their precision, these empaths could manipulate others as easily as they had once been manipulated. They had the knowledge, the intuition, and the awareness to control social situations with frightening effectiveness. But they didn't. That was what stunned Jung the most. Despite their power, these awakened empaths chose not to use it destructively. They didn't set out to humiliate or ruin their abusers. They didn't play the same games that had once broken them. They simply walked away. This restraint was what Jung found both beautiful and terrifying, because it proved that the empath's strength wasn't just emotional intelligence, it was moral intelligence. They could destroy, but they chose not to. They could expose, but they chose silence. And that silence was more powerful than any outburst could have been. Jung began calling them integrated empaths, souls who combined deep sensitivity with unshakable wisdom. To predators, they were untouchable. To healthy people, they were anchors. To Jung, they were living proof that the human mind was capable of evolving into something far more powerful than psychology had ever documented. But this realization carried a darker question. What would happen if someone deliberately weaponized this transformation? Jung couldn't shake the unease growing inside him. What he was witnessing wasn't just healing. It was power. And like any form of power, it carried danger. In his private journals, he admitted a disturbing possibility. If someone learned how to trigger an empath's transformation deliberately, it could be weaponized. Imagine an institution, a government, or a manipulative leader engineering betrayal to awaken empaths and then bending their gifts to serve destructive ends. The thought haunted him. That's why Jung never published his complete findings. He scattered them across private notes, letters, and fragments of essays, terrified of what might happen if the wrong people discovered the full process. To Jung, this wasn't theory. It was potential psychological warfare. And yet, he also recognized something deeply hopeful, because when empaths transformed naturally, when they integrated shadow and light on their own terms, they almost always chose the path of restraint, compassion, and truth. Their power didn't corrupt them, it clarified them. Still, the ethical dilemma weighed heavily on him. Jung wondered, what if just one empath chose differently? What if, instead of using their gift to heal, they chose to manipulate? Their ability to read, anticipate, and influence could make them nearly unstoppable. This duality is what made the empath's awakening both beautiful and terrifying. On one side, they became healers, protectors, architects of healthier systems. On the other, they carried the potential to outmaneuver even the most cunning predators. Jung's conclusion was clear. Awakened empaths represented not a disorder, but an evolution. And like every evolution, it could be used for creation or destruction. That question, what choice will the empath make, kept him awake at night. Over time, Jung began to see a pattern emerge. This wasn't random. The transformation of the empath followed stages, predictable, repeatable, almost like a map of psychological evolution. The first stage he called recognition. This was when the empath finally stopped dismissing their own perceptions. They realized that their sensitivity wasn't weakness, but data. Their feelings weren't irrational. They were accurate readings of reality. Recognition was the moment they began trusting their inner compass again. The second stage was integration. Here, the empath merged shadow and light. They stopped denying their suppressed intelligence, their rightful anger, their natural boundaries. They didn't become harsh. They became whole. They could be endlessly kind to those who deserved it, and ruthlessly precise with those who didn't. The third stage was application. This was the stage that fascinated and terrified Jung most. Integrated empaths learned to use their abilities strategically. They didn't just defend themselves anymore, they shaped their environments. They became what Jung described as psychological architects, people who could anticipate, redirect, and restructure human systems with supernatural precision. At this point, manipulation lost all power over them. They could see it coming from miles away and neutralize it before it ever took root. They weren't just healed, they were immune. The final stage was what Jung called the return to service. Once whole, many empaths began helping others through the same process. They created ripples of transformation, teaching, guiding, inspiring. They became nodes of resilience, quietly raising the psychological baseline of everyone around them. To Jung, these stages represented not just therapy, but evolution itself, a natural progression from fragility to sovereignty, from silence to mastery. And the most chilling realization of all, once this process began, it couldn't be stopped. So, what does all of this mean for you? Jung's most terrifying case wasn't about madness. It was about awakening. He discovered that empaths aren't fragile victims. They are dormant forces of nature. And the day they snap is not the day they break. It's the day they remember who they really are. Every empath will face this moment. For some, it comes as betrayal so deep it shatters every illusion. For others, it comes as the slow burn of a lifetime of silence. But the result is always the same: a choice. Do you remain the shock absorber of everyone else's dysfunction? Or do you step into the clarity of who you truly are? When the empath awakens, they don't become cruel. They become precise. They don't stop loving. They love with boundaries. They don't lose themselves. They finally find themselves. And from that moment forward, they can never be manipulated again. Jung wrote that this was both beautiful and terrifying, because it meant the kindest people on earth could no longer be controlled. And that, more than anything, is what society fears. So if you re-listening to this and you feel something stirring inside you, if you've ever felt like you see too much, feel too deeply, or carry too heavily, know this: you are not broken. You are not weak. You are simply waiting for your awakening. Write it in the comments right now if this resonates. I choose conscious transformation. And if this message touched you, subscribe today. Not for me, for you. Because if these words echo inside you, it means you're ready for the next chapter of your journey. Jung's work proved it. You are not here to remain silent. You are here to become sovereign. Remember this: the empath's greatest tragedy isn't their sensitivity. It's how long they wait to honor it. Don't wait any longer. Your sensitivity is not your curse, it is your weapon, and the day you learn to wield it consciously is the day you become unstoppable.